Okay, imagine this for a second. A piece of biblical prophecy, like a really central piece, studied for ages, right? And maybe, just maybe, it holds a secret hidden right there in the words, a translation thing that could flip our whole understanding of the end times. Let's unpack this. We're doing a deep dive today into Daniel chapter 9, specifically verses 24 to 27. We're focusing on something brought up in a transcript from RockIslandBooks on YouTube. It's about a translation discrepancy that's apparently been around for centuries.
It is pretty intriguing, yeah. The idea that a text like Daniel, which has been, pored over for so long, that it could still offer up this kind of, well, potentially massive reinterpretation based on the original language.
Yeah.
So our mission, if you like, for this deep dive is to really dig into what the Rock Island Books transcript claims. We want to look at the evidence they present and think about what this translation difference might actually mean.
Absolutely. And, to really get why this could be such a big deal, it helps to step back a bit. Think about how the Bible even got into English in the first place. You had John Wycliffe way back in the 14th century making it accessible, but he was working from Latin, the Vulgate. Then fast forward to the 16th century, and you get William Tyndale. Now, he's a key figure. He was the first to really go back to the original Hebrew and Greek for his English translation.
Right, and connecting that to the bigger picture, Tyndale, going back to the sources, that was huge, a real turning point. His work laid the groundwork, really, for so many English Bibles that came later. We're talking the Geneva Bible, which was incredibly influential, and then, of course, the King James Version. Kind of amazing how much of the KJV phrasing actually comes straight from Tyndale.
So, okay, this history is fascinating, but it leads to the big question that kept popping up for me from our source. What does all this translation history have to do with that famous prophecy in Daniel 9.24? The one about the 70 weeks.
That's the perfect question. And it's exactly where our deep dive into the source material really kicks off. Because if you look at pretty much any standard English translation of Daniel 9.24, like the ESV, or even the older Geneva Bible, you always see that phrase 70 weeks or something very close to it. And that's been the bedrock for how most people interpret this prophecy.
Exactly. But the source we're looking at, it throws a wrench in that. It argues that the original Hebrew text, well, it doesn't actually say 70 weeks. The claim is that the Hebrew really points to something more like 70-70, which, that's a pretty significant difference.
It really is. And the core of their argument focuses on these Hebrew words, Shabom Shabboth. The source emphasizes that Shabom, the first word, consistently means the number 70 throughout the Old Testament. Their point is that Shabom by itself, without another noun attached, never actually means weeks.
Yeah, and to back this up, the source gives quite a few examples. Like Exodus 38.29 talks about 70 talents of bronze, or Numbers 11.16, Moses gathers 70 men. Even in Judges 8.30, it says Gideon had 70 sons. These examples seem pretty consistent in showing Shabom just means the number 70.
So if Shabom just means 70, what about Shabboth? Well, if you take Shabom Shabboth literally, the source argues it translates simply as 70 70s or 70 times 70, which then begs the question, okay, how did we end up with 70 weeks being the standard translation in English?
Right. Well, according to the source material, a major turning point seems to be Jerome's Latin Vulgate back in the 4th century. The argument presented is that Jerome translated the phrase as 70 weeks into Latin, and that interpretation then carried over into English versions based on the Vulgate, like Wycliffe's Bible.
And that link is really important. Wycliffe didn't work from the Hebrew, he worked from Jerome's Latin. So the source suggests that Jerome's choice, way back then, had this long ripple effect. It potentially influenced later translations, maybe even the Geneva Bible. Now, the Geneva Bible translators did aim to use the original languages, but it was overseen by John Calvin.
Okay, and here's where it gets, really layered. The Geneva Bible actually has a footnote right there between the 70 and weeks in Daniel 9.24. And in that note, Calvin brings up Jeremiah's prophecy about the 70-year captivity in Babylon. He suggests God's mercy would, quote, sevenfold exceed his judgment. So 70 times 7, giving 490 years. And he explicitly connects that 490 years to, quote, even to the coming of Christ.
Right. And if you think about Calvin's overall theology, the source brings this up. His understanding, perhaps, that the church had sort of taken over Israel's role regarding God's promises, well, that viewpoint might have influenced how he interpreted this. Seeing 70 weeks as 490 years, that climax with Christ's crucifixion, fits neatly into that theological picture.
Okay, so that's one way to see it. But if we go back to the literal 70-70 translation that the source is pushing for, suddenly we're not talking 490 years. We're talking, what is that, 4,900 years? That's over 4 millennia longer?
Precisely. It's a vastly different scale. And to help make sense of such a long period, the source brings in the idea of the Jubilee calendar. Ancient Israel, a Jubilee year happened every 50 years. That's after 7 cycles of 7 sabbatical years. So if you have 100 Jubilee cycles, well, 100 times 49 years per cycle, that gets you to 4,900 years. Or perhaps 100 cycles of 50 years, giving 5,000 years. The source uses 100 Jubilees, equaling 4,900 years, linking back to the 70 by 70.
Okay, I see the math. So 100 Jubilees equals 4,900 years. And the source then makes a pretty bold connection. It suggests the starting point for this massive 4,900-year clock might be around 1848 BC. They link this date to the very beginnings of the nation of Israel, thinking about the promises to Abraham and Jacob and when Jacob's family went down into Egypt.
Yeah, it's an attempt to anchor this huge prophetic timeline in specific historical moments, at least as interpreted by the source. They connect what they identify as the 44th Jubilee around 1848 BC with this concept of 100 Jubilees in total, which, if you run the numbers forward, culminates way out in the future, around 353 AD. And according to this interpretation, that future date could mark something incredibly significant. Maybe the end of the current heaven and earth, the end of Israel as we know it now, a major cosmic shift.
Wow. And the prophecy also talks about things being divided, determined, decreed.
Right.
The source takes that divided part and suggests it could refer to this division within the 100 Jubilees, the 70 times 70. And it connects this potential end of the world scenario to the book of Revelation. The descriptions of a new heaven, a new earth, the new Jerusalem without a temple, no more sea.
Right. And if you bring Jeremiah back in, the source points to his prophecy about Israel enduring as long as the sun, moon, and stars exist. It sets up an interesting contrast with Revelation's vision of a new creation, where some of those elements, like the sun and moon, seem different or maybe aren't needed in the same way.
Okay, but I know what you're probably thinking listening to this. 3053 AD. That's like 1,000 years away. Why worry about this interpretation now?
That's a fair question. The source anticipates that. It suggests that even if the ultimate culmination is far off, the beginning of the end, so to speak, could already be underway. It briefly mentions ideas like a larger 756-year Jubilee cycle, and the concept of a 7,000-year plan based on the day is like a 1,000 years idea. The suggestion is we might be entering a really critical phase within those larger timelines, even now.
And they add another layer too, right? Mentioning the time of Jacob's trouble. That 7-year period often linked to the end times. The source even floats a potential start date for that, based on their calculations, maybe around 2025.
Yes, but it's crucial to emphasize. These specific dates, 2025, 3033 AD, they represent the particular interpretation laid out in this one source. Pinpointing exact dates for future prophetic events is, well, it's notoriously difficult, and there are many different views out there.
Sure. So, boiling it all down, the core tension highlighted by our source is this. Did a translation decision made centuries ago potentially mask a much, much bigger prophetic timeline? One spanning not just centuries, but millennia, covering the entire story of Israel and maybe even the cosmos.
That's the heart of it. The source material argues Daniel 9.24 isn't about 70 weeks, 190 years, but 70s, 4,900 years.
Yeah.
And this whole interpretation hangs on how you understand that Hebrew word Shabbat
Yeah.
and the history of Bible translation we talked about.
And for me, the real aha moment is just the sheer scale of that difference. The thought that one word may be misinterpreted or translated with a specific theological lens centuries ago could have potentially hidden this vast 4,900-year timeline from view for so long. It's pretty mind-bending.
It definitely gives you something to think about. So consider this. What does it mean if the prophecy is 4,900 years long instead of 490? Especially when you see the modern nation of Israel existing today, something unforeseen for centuries. How does that longer timeline change how you might view current events or the unfolding of prophecy?
Exactly. It raises so many questions. We definitely encourage you to look into the source material further if this sparks your interest, and just generally explore the different ways people understand biblical prophecy. It's a deep well.
Absolutely. And maybe we can leave you with this final thought to chew on. Could all these ongoing discussions, these reinterpretations of prophecies like the one in Daniel, could this activity itself be a sign? Maybe a sign that the time of the end Daniel spoke about is actually getting closer, prompting us perhaps to look again with fresh eyes, even at passages we thought we knew so well.